We are on board a Boeing 747 at the head of the runway 30 right at Dubai Airport, with the aircraft configured for takeoff and flight plan approved for Heathrow Airport in London. The METAR today at Dubai Airport at 9.25 hours Zulu informs us that there is a wind of 10 knots from 120 degrees. Visibility is 10 kilometers or more. There are some clouds at 6,000 feet. The temperature is 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and the dew point of 17 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. The QNH is 1016 millibars or 30.01 inches and is introduced into the altimeter. Landing lights and strobes are on, seatbelt signs are on, and the takeoff briefing was performed. In this tutorial, we will perform the Darax 3 Fox departure. For that, in the FMC, after entering the departure, the destination and activating the route, we have programmed in the next page the zero fuel weight, fuel reserves, and cost index. The cruise altitude will be 36,000 feet, and we have chosen the maximum takeoff thrust. For a weight of 732,900 pounds or 332,437 kilos with flap 10, V1 is 143 knots, the rotation speed is 158 knots, and V2 is 173 knots. We press the LSK for right, for the trim setting that we introduce in the pedestal. The route to London starts from Darax Point, so we have introduced Darax at first waypoint. We check the departure. The first point to intercept after takeoff is Emuni. According to the chart, the altitude at which we should intercept should not be less than 1,000 feet or above 4,000, which is programmed by entering 1,000 alpha, that is 1,000 or higher, and 4,000 bravo, that is 4,000 feet or less. The speed at this point is 167 knots. Also, as we can see in the chart, there is a limitation of bank angle to 25 degrees and an altitude restriction during the climb. The next 2 points are Delta Bravo 555 that we have to intercept at an altitude of no less than 3,000 feet, and Delta Bravo 557 that we have to intercept at an altitude of no less than 4,000 feet. Both points are also programmed into the FMC, but in Delta Bravo 555 the speed is 251 knots and according to the chart should not exceed 220 knots. We introduced 220/3,000 feet or higher and pressed the corresponding LSK. Also in Delta Bravo 557, the program speed is 319 knots and we have to adjust it to the published in the chart, which is 250 knots below 8,000 feet, so that in the scratch pad we write 250/4,000 or higher and we press in the LSK for right and in execute. The last 2 points to complete the SID are Nadut and Darax, which will be intercepted as we continue with our ascent at 25,400 and 30,900 feet respectively. On the vertical navigation page, we introduce again the speed limits below 8,000 feet, writing 250/8,000. In the altitude window, we introduce 4,000, which is the maximum altitude limit at Emuni. In speed window, we introduce 182, that is V2, 172 knots plus 10 knots. The flap is set in 10 degrees. The runway heading 300 degrees has been introduced. The auto throttle and flight director are active. The auto brakes are positioned in the RTO. In the case of a failure in the navigation system, on the radio 1 we have tuned the Dubai VOR in frequency 108.4 and the radial 300. In the communication radio is tuned Dubai North departure in 126.2. We are clear to take off. Put the engine at 70%. When stabilized, press toga and the aircraft accelerates. 80 knots. Up to this speed only can to abort the takeoff for serious damage or an engine fire. Throttle levers are under the control of the pilot. We are reaching V1. From this point we cannot abort the takeoff. If there is a failure, we must fly the plane. VR gently rotate the plane about 2 degrees per second to reach a pitch angle of about 14 degrees. When vertical, speed indicator begins to move and we have positive climb. Gear up. We adjust the angle of attack in order to fly V2 plus 10 knots to 182 knots. We have 400 feet AGL. We press flight level change, LNAV, and follow the flight director. As indicated by the chart, we continued in the tower frequency until instructed by ATC. We have reached 1000 feet and we fly at V2 plus 10, that is 182 knots. The tower called us to tell us that we called departure north in frequency 126.2. We call departure and the ATC informs us we are in radar contact and authorize us to continue our navigation. We press VNAV and as we have programmed the FMC, the flight director will guide us to 220 knots, which is the maximum speed at which we have to intercept Emuni. When the speed goes through 186, we retract flap 10. When the speed goes through 198, we retract flap 5. The speed continues to increase. When the speed passes 220, flaps up. We fly at 2000 feet and 220 knots, intercepting Emuni within the specifications of the chart. We put the autopilot, and the aircraft continues heading Delta Bravo 555, maintaining 220 knots as indicated in the FMC. Following the instructions in the chart, Delta Bravo 555 and Delta Bravo 557 are programmed into the FMC to be intercepted at 3000 and 4000 feet or higher, so that in the altitude window we can enter the transition altitude, that is 18,000 feet. We are intercepting Delta Bravo 555. We turn right, heading 033 towards Delta Bravo 557. While the aircraft accelerates to the speed programmed in the FMC 250 knots. We perform the after takeoff checklist. Gear off, auto brakes off, flaps up. We are intercepting Delta Bravo 557. The FMC puts us in heading 043 towards Mغادرت. The aircraft continues the climb while increasing speed towards the FMC programmed 334 knots. In this leg we reach 10,000 feet. We turn off the landing lights and remove seatbelts. A few miles of Mغادرت we are at 2,000 feet of the transition altitude, that is, of 18,000 feet. The ATC call us to clear us for the final flight level, 36,000 feet. In the altitude window we introduce 36,000 and we continue climbing while we intercepted Mغادرت. Over Mغادرت, the FMC situate us on 033 to go to the last point of the SID, Darax. En route to Darax, located 22.3 miles northeast of our current position and climbing to final flight level 36,000 feet, we end Darax 3 Fox SID.